Now, I just want to say a little bit about Scott Reich and Scott Peterson's resentencing for life without parole. He is resentenced to life yesterday, life in prison with no chance of parole. However, there is an ongoing appeals process. I just want to say something about Scott Reich reporting wrong information, misinformation, and wrong facts. Now, if I'm wrong, please clear me up if you know any better or if you know any different. But Scott Reich, who is supposed to be an experienced attorney, said on his podcast, live stream, whatever you want to call it, yesterday, that Scott Peterson is now 52 years old. How can a credible person who has online information available to him make such a terrible, terrible gaffe and a terrible, terrible error when reporting the age of a defendant? Scott Peterson, as far as I know, is not 52 years old, Scott Reich. She's 49 years old. Now, that might not seem like a big deal to most people. And I'm not saying that I always get the facts right. I'm not, or I don't, I'm not perfect. I don't always get the facts right. But for somebody who is supposed to be credible and who has resources like we all do to fact check, I'm absolutely astonished that he made such a gaffe with Scott Peterson's age. And this is somebody that we're supposed to be getting reliable information from. I do enjoy Scott Reisch's live streams. I watch him fairly regularly. I don't, always watch him from start to finish, but I do think he's engaging. I think he's well spoken. What I do like about Scott Reich is he started with the Chris Watts case, and I really like his take on the Chris Watts case. I don't agree with everything he says 100% of the time, but, in contrast to a certain creator, he doesn't try and use conspiracy theories to engage his audience, which I like. But I have noticed over the years that sometimes he does give misinformation, that he does, that he does spread at times misinformation. I don't think he does this intentionally. I don't think Scott Reich intentionally does this. For the most part, I like what he does. And for the most part, I enjoy Scott Reich. However, there are times when he's just absolutely wrong. And when he said Scott Peterson is 52, yesterday, and maybe am I the one that's wrong? I'm not saying Wikipedia is always correct. Wikipedia is not always correct, but as far as I know, Scott Peterson is not 52. And for somebody who is a credible, we're supposed to be taking as a credible attorney, with the amount of experience and knowledge that he's supposed to have, for somebody to make a gaffe like that, and it's like me saying that Barack Obama is 33. I mean, it's not that bad. It's not that bad. But, anything that is not his age or within that range of 49, 50 is completely and utterly wrong. So I don't know how, you have Scott Peterson's age online. I don't know how Scott Reich could have made a terrible gaffe like that. And sometimes I just find him slightly misleading. And I don't think he is intentionally does that. I mean, a lot of my subscribers, a lot of you will know who Scott Reich is, will have watched him. I'm not trying to bash Scott Reich because I do enjoy him a lot more than a certain creator who just spreads conspiracy theories. Scott Reich doesn't spread conspiracy theories, and that's what I respect him for. But sometimes he's just way off the mark in terms of the information that he gives. And a lot of people are relying on him to give credible information. Okay, so I watched the live stream of Scott Peterson's resentencing to life without parole yesterday. Interestingly enough, there were only 33 people or thereabouts watching the live stream. So interest in Scott Peterson is not, public interest in Scott Peterson is not nearly as high as it was back in the day when he was first charged and first appeared in court. However, the media fever is still there, and there were lots of media and lots of press and lots of reporters standing outside the courthouse. Most of the people who appeared in court, including Scott Peterson and his attorneys and the prosecution team, were wearing masks. But for the most part, I could make out who everybody was. I saw Janie and her husband. I saw Scott Peterson's half-sister, Susan, and her husband. I think her name is Susan, not 100% certain. But I will admit that, but I think her name is Susan. Scott Peterson was masked. His attorneys were masked. And I think Lacey's family were also masked up, but I could recognize them. I thought the judge handled the hearing pretty well. She was professional. She wasn't particularly warm, but she doesn't have to be. That's not her role. It's not her job to be warm. It's a sentencing hearing. And I appreciate and respect her professionalism. One thing she did say is that there was no cameras allowed. There was no recording of this live stream allowed. But anyway, let's just leave that matter at the door. But anyway, Scott Peterson I was expecting or hoping that Scott Peterson was going to speak. As his attorney, Pat Harris, said, Scott didn't speak. He sat there in his prison clothes and his mask. You could see that he was very alert, well aware to what was going on. But because he was masked, I couldn't see his complete facial expressions. But of course, he didn't want to be there. Scott Peterson wants to be free. What I did think was absolutely disgusting and distasteful about this hearing was that Pat Harris used it as an opportunity to try and retry the Scott Peterson case, almost as if he was trying to influence the judge. And the judge had one option. She could only sentence Scott to life in prison without parole. That's the only option that she had. And for Pat Harris to try and make this sentencing, which is really about the victims and the impact the victims' murders have had on the family, for Scott's attorney to try and make this all about poor Scott, I thought it was absolutely distasteful and quite disgusting. And also, another point I want to make, I think the judge was trying to be very respectful and she was trying to be impartial. And I can see that she was trying to do that, which is what she's supposed to do. She's supposed to be respectful. She's supposed to be impartial. She did her job. I do, however, believe that she allowed Scott Peterson's attorney to babble on too long. It was almost like Scott Peterson's attorney was trying to retry this case in front of the judge in some small hope that Scott Peterson wouldn't be sentenced to life. And it was just not the time to be doing that. And now I will get on to Lacey's family and their victim impact statements. Lacey's mother, her half-sister, and her brother all came to make victim impact statements. And as soon as Lacey's sister started crying, I started crying. And she talked about how this Lacey's murder has impacted her whole life, and how she doesn't have a sister, and how she wished that her sister was alive, and that her sister never got a chance to be a mother, and that broke me. It really did. Brent spoke about how it's affected his life, and they all spoke about how much Scott deserves to be in prison for the rest of his life. They all believe that Scott Peterson is guilty, just like I do. And Lacey's mother spoke, and she spoke with intent, and she spoke with anger and frustration and sadness and grief, as any mother would do. And she let it rip. She wasn't, she didn't hold back in her words for Scott Peterson, in her negative words, in her comments about Scott Peterson and how his evil actions have impacted her life. And I think they all did very well in speaking about how Lacey's murder has impacted them. And that part was just, when they gave their victim impact statements, that part was just heartbreaking. as usual, like I said, I was hoping that Scott Peterson was going to say something, even though he's a pathological liar. I was hoping that Scott Peterson was going to give a statement. I'm still not sure why he didn't, because Pat Harris was saying Scott Peterson is going to make a statement. He was saying this for weeks leading up to the resentencing, that Scott Peterson, his client, was going to make a statement. It never came. But I don't see any remorse from Scott Peterson. Didn't see an ounce of emotion. Scott Peterson hasn't changed one bit. He is exactly the same as he was all those years ago. The only thing that's different is that you can see that he has aged. Janie Peterson and Pat Harris spoke to reporters outside, and I think it's also disgusting how Janie Peterson made this hearing all about poor Scott. She never once said anything about how sad she feels about how Lacey was murdered. She never said anything about feeling sad for Lacey's family. It was all about poor Scott and how we shouldn't think he's guilty if we don't know what time Scott Peterson killed Lacey. If we don't know what she was, if we can't say what she was wearing at the time of her death, then we shouldn't believe that Scott Peterson is guilty, which is absolute rubbish. I see with Janie, Scott Peterson's sister-in-law, a lot of compassion for Scott, a lot of emotion for Scott. I see very little emotion for Lacey or Lacey's family. But the judge handled the proceedings very well. And I think it's quite ironic that the judge resentenced him to life in prison without parole, leading up to Christmas, which is around the time that Scott was telling Amber that he'd lost his wife and that he was widowed, which is around the time that, soon after Lacey vanished. I think Scott Peterson is as guilty as, and I think he's exactly where he needs to be. There were a lot of reporters, a lot of media, despite the public interest being a lot less than it used to be, and a lot less than it was back in the day. There was kind of a media frenzy, which will die down again and go away. It's interesting because the Elizabeth Holmes trial is happening right now, and I don't see the media frenzy over that. There's been hardly any reports or updates about the Elizabeth Holmes trial, the Elizabeth Holmes case, and there was a lot more reporting on Scott's resentencing for the time being, for this shorter period of time, than there has been for Elizabeth Holmes' whole entire trial, which has been going on for weeks. I also think it's quite disgraceful how both Janie and Pat Harris, they were just making it all about Scott, and making this what is supposed to be a resentencing, and it's supposed to be about the victims. They were all trying to make it about Scott's retrial. And it just goes to show you why Scott Peterson turned out the way he did. He's completely narcissistic, he's obnoxious, he's entitled, and his family believe that he is the victim. Which is like Chris Watts' family. They believe that Chris Watts is the victim. I don't believe that Scott is a victim. I believe that Scott Peterson is as guilty as, and he should be in prison for the rest of his life. But there is an ongoing appeals process. I think Scott Peterson should be behind bars for the rest of his life.